Welcome to Forgotten Worlds for Sleep. Tonight, we drift back more than 1,000 years to the age when the North first awoke. Before there were kingdoms, before there were borders, there were only ships cutting through the fog, like knives through fate. These are not just stories of conquest, they are echoes of survival, faith, and fire. From the monks of Lindisfarne, who saw dawn turn to blood, to the sons of Vikings who rose as kings. Every chapter of this saga carries the same pulse, the will to endure. So as you lie back and let the sound of the sea surround you, imagine the glow of distant torches on a frozen shore, the whisper of sails filled with cold northern wind, and the beginning of everything that came after. This is the Northern Tide, the story of how raiders became rulers, how chaos became empire, and how even when the world sleeps, the past still remembers. Far beyond the soft horizons of Rome, where olive trees once whispered to marble columns, the world hardened into something older, rougher, and infinitely colder. Here, at Europe's northern edge, the sun itself seemed uncertain of its duties, lingering far too long in summer, vanishing completely in winter. Between light and darkness, between fire and ice, a people were being forged. The mountains did not invite, they warned. The seas did not comfort, they tested. Snow muffled every sound except the wind's unending sermon about endurance. For half the year, the land slept under white silence. For the other half, it demanded furious labor before sleep returned again. Each grain of barley sown was an act of faith. Each fish pulled from black water a tiny rebellion against hunger. Nothing was easy here, so nothing was taken for granted. The North demanded payment in sweat, and sometimes in blood, for every day survived. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to live where the sky forgets how to change color? Would you keep working when the earth itself seems to whisper that you should lie down and rest forever? The first settlers who clung to these coasts learned quickly that nature could not be tamed. It could only be respected. They built low houses of timber and turf, burrowing into the soil as if trying to become part of it. Smoke curled from roof holes into air sharp enough to cut. Inside, families huddled close, sharing heat, stories, and the slow comfort of something cooked over the fire. They measured time not by clocks, but by need. When the ice cracked, it was time to fish. When moss grew thick on stones, it was time to sow. When the ravens grew restless, it was time to harvest before the snow came again to erase the world. How long could you endure a place where even summer smells faintly of frost? Could you find beauty in survival itself? Scarcity became their teacher, and cooperation their only defense. A broken net or a sick ox was not one family's problem, it was everyone's. Alone, no one lasted long. Together, they could outlast the storm. From that necessity grew a quiet equality, a sense that worth was measured by usefulness, not titles. In this frozen democracy, a woman who could keep a hearth alive through blizzard carried as much honor as a man who could steer a boat through lightning. The land gave little, but the sea. The sea gave everything and nothing. Its moods shifted faster than prayer. One dawn it glittered with silver fish. The next, it swallowed whole crews without remorse. Yet it was the only road out, the single promise that the world did not end at the horizon's line. Can you imagine standing on a cliff, feeling that pull, fear and wonder braided together, while waves explode below your feet? Would you sail, knowing you might never return? In the long dark months, when the sun abandoned them and the aurora rippled like ghost fire across the heavens, the people of the North turned inward. They carved wood, forged iron, and wove stories. The tales were not luxuries. They were survival tools for the mind. Around every hearth, ancestors became heroes, and heroes became gods. Children learned that even the gods bled, even giants fell, and that courage mattered more than victory. The environment wrote its lessons into their bones. Patience, because winter always comes back. Pragmatism, because ideals don't catch fish. Defiance, because sometimes all that stands between you and death is stubbornness. Slowly, These lessons became culture, then myth, then destiny. When daylight finally returned, it was greeted not with rest, but with frenzy. Fields were planted, boats repaired, roofs patched, debts repaid. 6 months to prepare for the next 6 of silence. 6 months to ensure the gods would find offerings on the altars, and families would find food on the table. The rhythm never changed, only the generations dancing to it. And each generation grew a little tougher, a little craftier, until hardship felt less like punishment and more like proof of purpose. Perhaps that is the secret of the North, suffering not as tragedy, but as forge. Would you survive this forge, or would it unmake you? Beyond the frozen horizon, empires rose and crumbled, oblivious to the quiet strength forming in this wilderness. No chroniclers came to record their births, no kings claimed their allegiance. Yet within these valleys and fjords, a fire was gathering, slow, patient, unstoppable. The world would one day call them Vikings. But before they took to the seas, they learned first how to conquer the cold. In the North, character was not taught, it was hammered into being. The land itself was the teacher, and its lessons were never gentle. Every storm carried instruction, every failed harvest a warning. Through centuries of struggle, the Norse soul took form, not in comfort, but in collision with the unforgiving. They grew up under a sky that changed moods like a god, merciless one hour, magnificent the next. Children learned early that tears froze faster than they fell. Boys mended nets before they could walk straight. Girls learned the language of fire, how to feed it, how to coax it through the night without wasting a spark of wood. Discipline wasn't a virtue here, it was air. When a child stumbled, no hand lifted them right away. The North demanded that you learn to rise on your own, or not at all. Could you have survived your own childhood here? How many lessons can you learn from hunger before you start to respect it? Winter was not an enemy to be defeated, but a ruler to be obeyed. And those who obeyed learned her rhythm. The bite of the wind, the creak of frozen wood, the warning hiss of snow sliding from a roof heavy with ice. In every sound, a message. In every silence, danger. The North didn't kill the careless out of cruelty, only indifference. It was this indifference that shaped them most of all. To survive in such a world was to understand that life owed you nothing. That hard truth became a kind of faith, stronger than any god they would later name. The people of the North didn't believe in luck, they believed in preparation. When rivers froze, they built sleds. When crops failed, they salted fish. When tragedy came, as it always did, they met it not with despair, but with a phrase whispered like prayer. So it must be. How do you keep hope alive when the world never promises mercy? Would you still dream? If every dream came at the cost of survival, their isolation became their armor. Where Rome had marble roads and Persia had palaces, the Norse had each other. Villages clung to coastlines like barnacles, small enough for every face to be known, every death to be felt. Suspicion of strangers was instinct. Trust, once given, was iron. Betray it, and you would not need exile. The cold itself would erase you. Yet for all their hardness, they were not without grace. The same hand that could kill a boar could also carve delicate runes into bone, tracing beauty where the world offered none. They found poetry in thunder, balance in storm, and even tenderness in endurance. They did not separate beauty from survival. They were the same act. Night after night, while wind screamed through cracks in timber, families sat close. Firelight shimmered over faces young and ancient. They told stories not to escape the world, but to explain it, to give shape to chaos. The sagas were more than entertainment. They were instruction manuals for the soul. Through them, children learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to keep walking into it. What story would you tell to keep yourself alive through 6 months of darkness? Could you believe in heroes when the world gave you none? Every generation added a line to those stories, polishing them like stones passed from hand to hand. When they spoke of giants, they were talking about the mountains. When they spoke of monsters in the sea, they meant the storms. Even their gods, fierce, flawed, doomed, were reflections of their own lives. They didn't pray for salvation. They prayed for strength enough to endure what must come. They came to see the world not as enemy or gift, but as test. The true sin was weakness, the highest virtue, resilience. And so, their spirit became steel sheathed in frost. From that steel came everything that followed. The law, the ship, the sword. It's easy, centuries later, to see them only as raiders, warriors, conquerors. But before the Longships, before the raids, before the name Viking even existed, there was this. A people sculpted by silence, taught by scarcity, and tempered by survival. They were not born violent, they were born vigilant. And when the world offered them no mercy, they decided to take destiny into their own hands. Would you blame them for what they became, or admire them for what they endured? If the cold had shaped you, what kind of soul would it leave behind? Because here, in the frozen edges of the map, the Norse learned the oldest lesson of all, that before you can conquer the world, you must first conquer yourself. In the north, time did not move in a straight line. It circled like a raven returning to its roost. Every year, the same struggle, the same race against cold and hunger. 6 months of light to prepare for 6 months of darkness. Summer was never lazy, it was desperate. Winter, never peaceful, it was judgment. When the first buds appeared on the birch trees, it was not beauty they saw, it was warning. The clock had started ticking again. Men repaired nets stiff from frost, sharpening harpoons and readying the ropes that had frayed during the dark. Women brought out seeds wrapped in linen, counting them like treasures. Every seed a prayer, every handful a risk. If frost came too soon, their hope would die in the soil. Can you imagine living where the sun is both savior and executioner? How would you feel if every sunrise meant both life and a deadline? There was no room for idleness. The brief summer demanded sacrifice, sleep, rest, comfort. Children gathered berries until their fingers bled. Elders mended sails while their eyes squinted against midnight light that refused to fade. For weeks, the sky never turned black. It shimmered instead with the pale gold of endless dusk. The world itself seemed suspended between waking and dreaming. Yet even in light, they felt the shadow of what was coming. Winter, always winter. It waited like a creditor who never forgot a debt. By late harvest, the air thickened with urgency. Livestock were slaughtered. Fish were salted and hung like silver leaves from the rafters. Smokehouses whispered through the valleys, carrying the scent of survival. Every act was a ritual of calculation. How many mouths? How much grain? How long till the first frost? The Norse learned to measure hope in barrels, not prayers. If you knew famine was coming every year, what would you value most? Courage, caution, or community? Would you save for tomorrow, or feast before the dark? When the snow finally fell, it came not as surprise, but as sentence. Doors were sealed with moss, windows covered with animal skins. Outside, the world fell silent. Only the wind and the wolves had voices now. Inside the longhouses, life compressed into a few dimly lit meters. Humans and animals sharing breath, warmth, and the slow rhythm of waiting. Children learned to count time not by days, but by the dwindling of stored food. The hearth became the heart of existence, the only sun left to worship. Every flame was sacred, every ember guarded. The sound of winter in the north was not howling winds or cracking ice. It was silence, a silence so deep that it seemed to press against your skull, to test the limits of your own thoughts. Many feared not starvation, but solitude. To survive winter was not only to endure the cold, but to fight madness itself. Could you live half your life in darkness and still believe in light? What would happen to your mind if months passed without the sound of a stranger's voice? In that darkness, stories became lifelines. The sagas were spoken softly, carried from mouth to mouth like coals from dying fire. They told of giants and gods, of heroes who challenged the impossible and paid the price. In the telling, people remembered something vital. that survival was not merely to exist, but to endure with purpose. The story itself became nourishment when bread ran low. And so, generation by generation, they learned to live with the rhythm of the earth's cruelty, to prepare, endure, rebuild, and repeat. Each season tested a different virtue. Summer demanded endurance, autumn demanded discipline, winter demanded faith. Only spring offered forgiveness, but even that briefly. The North gave no mercy, yet in its brutality, it gave meaning. To live here was to live truthfully, stripped of illusion, of luxury, of softness. Every scar was proof that you had existed another year against the odds. They did not call it suffering, they called it life. When the first crack of thaw came, when rivers groaned under melting ice, hearts leapt with relief too deep to speak. The cycle would begin again, the work, the fear, the fleeting moments of beauty between storms. They were trapped in the circle, yet somehow, they belonged to it. It was both prison and home. Could you live in a world that never changed, and yet demanded that you change every year? Would you call that curse, or destiny? From this endless cycle came the Norse spirit, a mind tuned to resilience, a body made for labor, a heart that could find pride even in pain. The seasons were not their enemy. They were the forge in which identity was shaped. For them, survival was never just about staying alive. It was about proving they deserved to be. In the North, the hearth was more than fire. It was civilization itself. Beyond its glow, the world belonged to wolves and spirits. Within it, humanity found its reason to endure. Every Norse household was a small kingdom, ruled not by crown or charter, but by flame and family. At the center of every longhouse burned a single fire, smoky, fragrant, eternal. It never went out. Even when the family slept, a watcher stayed awake to feed it, to whisper to it, to guard against the cold's return. The fire was their sun during the endless dark, their anchor when storms howled against the roof. To lose the fire was to invite death. What would it mean to live in a world where one ember stood between warmth and oblivion? Could you sleep knowing that your family's life depended on a flame no bigger than your hand? The longhouse itself was a world under one roof. Walls of timber and turf curved like the ribs of a ship turned upside down. A home built to weather storms from every direction. Smoke drifted through the rafters, mingling with the scent of pine and dried fish. Animals shared space with people. Sheep, goats, sometimes even the family's prized horse. Their breath warmed the air, their presence a reminder of what survival demanded: cooperation, not comfort. There was no privacy, no solitude. A cough in the dark could wake 10 others. Children grew up under the watchful eyes of elders, learning the art of silence, the weight of respect, and the meaning of belonging. To belong was everything. Isolation was the truest punishment. Could you live your life never truly alone? Every sound, every breath shared? Would that closeness bring comfort or madness? The Norse family was both fortress and factory. Every hand had purpose. Men split wood and mended sails. Women brewed, wove, and managed the stores that meant life or death by midwinter. Yet the line between their duties blurred more often than outsiders imagine. When men were gone on voyages or hunts, women ruled without hesitation, not as caretakers, but as commanders. Property, trade, even law rested in their hands. The sagas tell of women who negotiated alliances, led farms, and sometimes wielded blades. They were not queens of ceremony, but of substance. Around the hearth, power was quiet but unmistakable. The matriarch, keeper of keys, held authority over stores, chests, and secrets. The patriarch, speaker at the thing, carried honor beyond the door. Between them stretched a partnership forged not in sentiment, but necessity. Love was not the foundation of Norse marriage. Survival was. Love, if it came, was a fortunate luxury. In a world where survival demanded strength from everyone, what did equality look like? Could love grow in a marriage born from alliance rather than affection? Children were the house's future and its burden. They learned early to earn their keep. At 5, they carried wood. At 10, they fished. At 12, they were no longer called children. Those who could not work, the sick, the frail, the unlucky, were cared for as long as the family could afford to. When they couldn't, nature made its own decisions. It sounds cruel now, but to the Norse, it was fairness. The gods themselves obeyed the same law. Nothing wasted, nothing promised. Evenings were the only softness the world allowed. As the wind pushed snow against the door, the family gathered close. Someone, usually the eldest, would begin a tale. The sagas were not entertainment. They were instruction wrapped in rhythm. Through them, children learned the weight of honor, the price of betrayal, and the glory of endurance. The stories made sense of suffering. They turned the chaos of nature into narrative, the randomness of fate into pattern. Who tells your story when you sleep? And what if the story you inherit teaches you that pain is sacred? Inside those longhouses, humanity burned brighter than anywhere else. Songs rose above the crackle of fire, low, rhythmic, made for memory. Women wove cloth to that beat. Men carved handles for axes or repaired broken tools. Each action linked them across generations, from father to son, from mother to daughter, from ancestor to memory. They believed their homes were sacred spaces, bridges between worlds. At the doorposts, carved faces of gods and guardians watched silently. The threshold was not merely wood and stone. It was a border between order and chaos. Step outside, and you entered a world of beasts, cold, and uncertainty. Step inside, and you entered the fragile kingdom of warmth, love, and duty. This was where identity began, not on the battlefield or the sea, but at the firelight's edge. Here, courage was learned not through bloodshed, but through patience. Leadership, not through conquest, but through care. It was the hearth, not the sword, that taught the Norse how to endure. And from that endurance, a civilization began to form. Would you have survived your own long winter? Would you know how to keep the fire alive, in wood or in spirit? Because before they learned how to conquer others, they first learned how to protect each other. And that lesson of flame, of family, of unbreakable kin would burn in their hearts long after the smoke had faded into history. To the Norse, the sea was both mother and monster. It fed them, carried them, tested them, and sometimes swallowed them whole. Its breath filled their lungs. Its moods decided their fates. For every grain of barley coaxed from frozen soil, 10 fish were dragged from its depths. The sea was not a choice. It was a sentence, a promise, and a prayer. Stand on a northern cliff at dawn, and you can still feel it. The vast pull of the horizon, the roar that shakes the bones of the earth. Below, waves shatter against stone, spraying salt that stings like truth. The air smells of iron and life. Somewhere, a single sail flaps against the wind, daring the impossible. Would you have stepped into that boat, knowing the sea has no mercy? What would drive you to trade the land you know for the horizon you don't? Generations of Norsemen and women stood before that same horizon. Hunger behind them, possibility ahead. Between the two, water, endless and unpredictable. They learned its language the way children learn fear, instinctively. They watched the color of clouds, the tilt of gulls, the pattern of waves. They listened for the low hum before a storm, a note so deep it vibrated through their feet. In time, they learned to read the sea better than any scripture. Their first boats were small, crude, planks lashed together with hope. They hugged the coasts, never venturing too far from the line of home. But necessity is a better teacher than bravery. When the fish grew scarce or the villages hungry, they pushed further. Each voyage stretched the edge of their world a little wider. One day, someone didn't turn back, and from that day on, the sea owned them. How far would you go before fear told you to stop? What if the only way to feed your family was to defy the ocean itself? Every boat that left shore carried not just men, but the weight of their family's survival. The women stood on the rocks, eyes narrowed against the glare, memorizing each sail until it disappeared into the gray. They whispered to the gods of wind and water, bargaining with words older than prayer. No one ever said goodbye, only see you again. In the north, you didn't tempt fate by assuming return. Out there on the open water, life reduced itself to its simplest equation: wind, wood, and will. The waves were not enemies to fight, but moods to navigate. When storms came, there was no shelter, only trust. Trust in the ship, in the crew, in your own strength to keep rowing when the sky fell apart. And when the sea went calm, that trust turned to vigilance, because calm seas often hid betrayal beneath the surface. They learned patience, the kind that wears grooves into the soul. They learned humility, the kind that comes when the horizon laughs at your courage. But they also learned mastery. Each voyage built knowledge. How to find currents that pulled you home. How to listen to the sea's shifting rhythm. How to read stars when clouds erase the sky. Do you think courage is born from strength, or from the refusal to stop when you're afraid? Could you sleep with the sea's heartbeat under your head, knowing it might change its mind by morning? The sea gave them everything and nothing in equal measure. It provided food when the land went barren, paths where none had existed, and wealth that glittered like salvation. But it demanded a price. Sometimes in ships, sometimes in suns. When storms took the fishermen, the women burned candles and said nothing. Grief was not performed. It was carried quietly, like a stone in the pocket of the soul. Every family had names that the sea had kept, and still they went back, because something about the sea spoke to the deepest part of the Norse heart, the part that refused stillness. The sea was movement, and movement was life. Even the gods, they believed, crossed its waters. To master it was to become more than mortal. And so, they built better ships. Stronger, faster, sharper. They learned to bend with the way others bent steel, to curve it into hulls that sliced through waves instead of fighting them. Each improvement carried them further, past the coasts, past fear, into legend. When they returned, they brought stories of lands that smelled of strange flowers, of sun that lingered longer, of wealth waiting beyond the fog. The sea had changed them. It had given them something new, imagination. And imagination, once awakened, cannot be contained. Have you ever stood at the edge of your world and felt it calling you to step beyond? Would you answer that call, or turn back to safety? Because for the Norse, safety was the one thing they could never afford. The sea taught them that risk was not the opposite of life, it was the proof of it. And as their ships grew faster and their courage greater, the sea that had once confined them would become their highway, their empire, their destiny. The same waves that fed their children would soon carry them across the world, not as fishermen, but as something far more dangerous, as explorers, as conquerors, as Vikings. When the world outside froze solid and the sea fell silent, the Norse turned inward, to warmth, to memory, to story. The Longhouse became a universe contained by timber and firelight. Outside, the wind screamed across the drifts. Inside, the voice of one storyteller could quiet an entire world. In those endless nights, words became as vital as bread. A tale could feed the spirit as surely as meat fed the body. For in the North, to survive was not only to keep breathing, but to keep believing. Can you imagine living months without sunlight, where your only light came from words? What stories would you tell to keep the darkness at bay? They told of heroes and monsters, gods and giants, of worlds linked by a tree so vast its roots touched the underworld, and its branches brushed the stars. Each story had power because it explained what nothing else could. Why the sun fled each winter. Why thunder spoke the language of anger. Why even the gods could fall. The storytellers were not priests. They were keepers of memory. They held the tribe's history in rhythm and rhyme, spoken in the flicker between shadow and flame. To forget a tale was no small sin. It was to erase a piece of who they were. Because before the North learned to write with ink, it wrote with voice. Children lay awake beside the fire, eyes wide as the old men spoke of Odin, the wanderer with one eye, who traded sight for wisdom, of Thor, the thunder god whose hammer struck against chaos itself, of Loki, the deceiver, who smiled even as his tricks burned the world. These were not distant deities. They were reflections. Each god carried the same contradictions as the people who worshipped them. Strength mixed with folly, courage mixed with pride. They were divine because they were flawed. The Norse saw themselves not as servants of the gods, but as participants in their struggle. Would you trust a god who could fail? Or would you find comfort in knowing even the divine must fight to endure? The sagas were more than entertainment. They were education. They taught when to fight and when to flee, how to earn honor, and how to face death without flinching. In their stories, the worst sin was cowardice, the highest virtue, perseverance. A hero might die, but he never begged for mercy. To live without courage was a slower kind of death. The women wove as the men spoke, fingers moving in time with the words. Each thread on the loom became a kind of echo, turning sound into color, story into tapestry. The hum of the spindle joined the voice of the fire, a quiet percussion beneath the tales. It was said that fate itself was woven this way. The Norns, three sisters of destiny, spinning the thread of every life. And somewhere between their hands and the storyteller's tongue, the Norse found meaning in the chaos. Do you think stories can shape fate, or do they only teach us how to face it? If your life were a saga, what lesson would you leave behind? Outside, the aurora rippled across the frozen heavens, green, red, violet, like the banners of gods warring in the sky. To the Norse, those lights were souls of the fallen, carried by Valkyries to Odin's hall. Every flicker in the heavens was a reminder. Life was brief, but glory could be eternal. They called their heaven Valhalla, a warrior's paradise where the brave feasted after death, only to rise and fight again at dawn. It was not peace they imagined beyond life, but purpose. Even in eternity, struggle was sacred, and that belief made them fearless. As the fire dimmed and the last sparks rose toward the roof beams, silence would fall again. But it was not empty silence. It was charged alive. Everyone had been changed just slightly by what they'd heard. The story had done its work. It had stitched them tighter together. Because in the North, storytelling wasn't escape. It was endurance. It taught them that meaning could survive even when the sun could not. That laughter and terror, faith and doubt, were not opposites but companions around the same flame. When everything you love turns to ice, what story keeps your heart alive? And when your story ends, will anyone still tell it? The fire crackled one last time, throwing sparks into the dark like stars. Someone whispered a final line, a prayer, a warning, or a promise. The wind answered. The story joined the others in memory, to be told again when the night grew long. And in that small circle of light, surrounded by cold and silence, the Norse kept the oldest truth alive. That stories do not merely survive us. They are the only part of us that never dies. Before time began, before men, before even the gods, there was nothing. No sky, no earth, no fire, no frost, only the great void. The Norse called it Ginnungagap, the yawning gap, the silent breath before creation. Then, from the edges of the nothing, came two forces, the frost of Nibelheim to the north, and the fire of Muspelheim to the south. Where they met, the world began to dream. Imagine a place where heat and cold collide so violently that reality itself begins to take shape. From the melting ice rose steam, and from that steam came life. Not human, not God, but the first being, Ymir, the frost giant. From his sweat, other giants were born, creatures of chaos and cold. And from the dripping rime, another being formed, a cow, Audhumla, whose milk nourished Ymir. She licked the salty ice for sustenance, and as she licked, the ice melted and revealed the first of the gods. He was Buri, ancestor of all that would come. From him descended Bor, and from Bor came three sons, Odin, Vili, and Vi. The brothers looked upon Ymir and saw not life, but danger. They struck him down, and from his death created the world. His blood became the seas, his bones the mountains, his skull the sky, and from his mind's chaos they formed order. What would it feel like to live in a world made from the body of a slain god? Can creation and destruction ever truly be separated? The brothers set the sun and moon in motion, hung stars like jewels in the firmament, and built Midgard, the realm of men, at the center of all things. They tamed the elements, not by mastery, but by balance. Frost against flame, storm against stillness, chaos against order. They knew the world could never be perfect, only sustained. Then, walking along the shore, Odin and his brothers found two pieces of driftwood. One they shaped into a man, the other into a woman. They breathed into them life, thought, and movement, and thus were born Ask and Embla, the first humans, fragile, curious, and mortal. The gods built a wall of bones around their home to protect them from the giant's wrath. This was humanity's beginning, a gift carved from violence, guarded by divine mercy, and doomed by the same flaw that made the gods themselves restless, the desire to understand. If your creators were born from blood and ice, would you still call them holy? Could you love gods who kill to create? The cosmos, as the Norse saw it, was a vast tree, Yggdrasil, the world tree, whose branches held the heavens and whose roots touched the underworld. 9 realms hung upon it like worlds upon a spine. Asgard, home of the gods, Midgard, realm of men, Jotunheim, land of giants, Niflheim, of frost and death, Muspelheim, of flame and fury, Alfheim, of light spirits, Svartalfheim, of dark ones, Vanaheim, of the older gods, and Helheim, the realm of the dead, all bound by roots that dripped with eternity. The gods themselves were not distant monarchs. They were participants in the same struggle as humans. They could bleed, hunger, laugh, and die. Their greatness came not from perfection, but from persistence. Odin's wisdom was bought with pain, his eyes sacrificed for vision into the mysteries of fate. Thor's strength was endless battle, and Loki, the trickster, was proof that even divine realms needed chaos to remain alive. Would you trade an eye for understanding? If you could glimpse fate, would you still walk toward it? Every night, Odin's ravens flew over the world, bringing him whispers for men and gods alike. He knew that even the divine could not escape destiny. The Norns, 3 sisters who wove the tapestry of existence, wrote every life, even the gods, into the web of time. Each thread began bright, grew tangled, and finally snapped. Nothing was exempt, not even the heavens. This truth was not tragic to the Norse. It was sacred. They believed that even the end of the gods, the twilight called Ragnarok, was not failure but fulfillment. A cycle must close for another to begin. Death was not the opposite of life. It was its confirmation. And so, when the Norse looked to the skies and thunder rolled, they didn't hear random weather. They heard Thor defending order. When the aurora lit the night, they saw the shields of Valkyries escorting fallen warriors to Odin's hall. The world itself was a living story, and every sound, every storm, every silence was part of it. Do you see the world as chaos, or a story still being told? If the gods died so the world could live, what might you be asked to sacrifice? For in these myths, the Norse found not escape from their brutal world, but reflection of it. Their gods were not promises of paradise. They were companions in struggle, mirrors of the same endurance the people of the North already practiced every day, against winter, hunger, and fate. And maybe that was the secret of their faith. They didn't pray to be spared from hardship. They prayed to be worthy of surviving it. Every world needs a crack in its perfection. Even among gods, there must be one who laughs when the rest stay solemn, who dares to pull the threads of order just to see what unravels. In the Norse world, that crack had a name, Loki. He was the fire that would not obey. Neither god nor giant, neither hero nor villain. Loki was the echo of chaos itself, charming, clever, dangerous, necessary. He could whisper wisdom or unleash ruin with the same smile. Where Odin sought knowledge and Thor sought justice, Loki sought something purer, freedom. Do you ever feel that rules exist only to be tested? If order keeps the world alive, who keeps it interesting? Born of giants, yet raised among gods, Loki lived between worlds. He could walk through any door, belong everywhere and nowhere. With words as sharp as any sword, he twisted truth into poetry and lies into prophecy. The gods needed him, though they would never admit it, because without Loki, even Asgard, the shining realm of the divine, would grow stagnant. He was the spark that kept the heavens awake. His laughter could fill Odin's golden hall one moment and ignite it the next. He tricked Thor into humility, outwitted giants who threatened the gods, and once even cut off Sif's golden hair, only to replace it with strands of spun gold finer than silk. He brought gifts and curses in equal measure. The hammer Mjolnir, the spear Gungnir, and the ship Skidbladnir all owed their existence to his mischief. The gods scolded him, banished him, praised him, rewarded him, often all in the same day. Can chaos create as much as it destroys? Would you trust the one who lies to save you, if it meant breaking every rule? But every jest has a shadow. Loki's laughter grew sharper as the centuries turned. From the mother of monsters, he fathered 3 children. Hel, who ruled the dead, Jormungandr, the world serpent who encircled the seas, and Fenrir, the wolf fated to devour the sun. Even the gods, who once called him brother, began to fear him. They could not kill him, prophecy forbade it, but they began to watch his smile a little too closely. Odin, wise and weary, understood that even chaos has its place. Without Loki, he said, we would never test our strength. But others whispered that every trick the shapeshifter played brought Ragnarok closer. And perhaps they were right, because one day Loki would go too far. He once disguised himself as a falcon, a mare, a fish, a flame, always something other than himself. He was the ultimate mirror, reflecting everyone's fears, desires, and contradictions back at them. To love Loki was to see your own flaws staring back, and to laugh at them anyway. Who are you when no one expects you to be anything? Is rebellion always evil, or simply the courage to exist beyond permission? But chaos, once unleashed, cannot stay small. Loki's greatest crime was not trickery, it was truth. When he finally spoke what all the gods secretly feared, that their order was temporary, their power fragile, their virtues hollow. They called him mad, dangerous, unforgivable. He became what every society needs when its rules begin to crack, a scapegoat for its reflection. When Baldur, the shining god of light, was killed by an arrow of mistletoe, the one weapon that could harm him, it was Loki's hand that guided it. And with that act, the laughter stopped. The gods bound him in the entrails of his own son, chained him beneath the earth, where venom dripped upon his face. His screams shook the world. His wife, Sijin, stayed by his side, catching the poison in a bowl. But each time she turned to empty it, the drops that fell upon Loki's skin made the earth quake with pain. The gods thought they had silenced chaos, but the North knew better. The moment Loki's laughter died, the world began its slow slide toward Ragnarok, the twilight of gods. Can order survive without its shadow? Or does every cage create the rebellion that will one day break it? Because Loki was more than a trickster. He was the universe's reminder that control is an illusion, that every law exists only until someone dares to laugh at it, that every paradise contains its own undoing, and maybe that's what keeps it real. Even chained beneath the earth, Loki's smile lived on, in every storm, in every accident, in every spark of genius born from defiance. The North never forgot him. They saw a little of him in themselves, in the fisherman who cheats the sea, the farmer who tricks the frost, the wanderer who refuses to stay where he's told. Because Loki, at his core, was not a god to fear. He was a truth to recognize. When you break a rule, is it rebellion or evolution? And when you laugh at power, do you weaken it or set it free? Some said his laughter still echoes in thunder. Others said it waits, silent, until the end of days, when he will rise again to remind gods and men alike that no order lasts forever. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, chained but still smiling, the trickster whispers the secret of every world ever made. Nothing stays still, not even the gods. The North believed that everything living, gods, men, beasts, even the wind, hung from a single spine of the universe. They called it Yggdrasil, the world tree. Its roots drank from 3 wells of fate. Its branches held the 9 realms in their embrace, and between its roots, where shadows never ended, destiny was being written, one thread at a time. Have you ever wondered if your choices are truly yours? Or if some unseen hand already decided where your road will end? The world tree was not just a symbol. It was alive, vast beyond imagining, older than the gods themselves. From its upper branches, the eagle watched all that lived. Beneath, a serpent, NHGGR, gnawed endlessly at its roots. Between them, a squirrel called Ratatoskr ran up and down the trunk, carrying insults between beast and bird, ensuring the world never knew peace for long. Even the cosmos, the Norse believed, contained gossip and grudges. The 3 roots of Yggdrasil reached into 3 worlds. One touched the well of wisdom, where Odin had traded his eye for sight beyond sight. Another reached the well of fate, where the Norns wove every life into being. And the last sank deep into the land of ice and shadow, where death whispered to the living through dreams. Every morning, the Norns appeared, 3 sisters cloaked in mist and memory. Urd, who knew what had been, Verdandi, who measured what is, and Skuld, who whispered what is yet to come. They drew water from the well and poured it over Yggdrasil's roots, keeping the tree alive. Without them, time itself would rot. If you could meet the ones who wove your fate, what would you ask them? Would you beg for mercy, or demand to see the thread yourself? Odin, ever restless, once stood before them. He asked not how long he would live. He already knew the answer was not long enough. He asked instead how to face what could not be changed. The Norns said nothing. They only smiled, and their hands moved faster across the loom. For even a god could not read what was still being woven. The Norse saw destiny not as a cage, but as a river, powerful, unstoppable, yet shaped by every stone it passed. Each action created ripples that changed its flow. A man could not escape his fate, but he could decide how to meet it, to die bravely or cower in fear. That was the only freedom the universe allowed. Would you rather know your fate, or be forever uncertain of it? Which is worse, to see your end coming, or to never see it at all? When the wind howled through the fjords, the people said it was Yggdrasil sighing. When lightning split the sky, they said the great trees' branches trembled. They did not see the world as separate from the divine. It was the divine. To harm the earth, the forest, or the sea was to wound the body of creation itself. That's why every oath sworn beneath an ash tree was sacred. Every promise broken near its roots carried the weight of cosmic betrayal. And beneath those roots, the serpent in Aegir continued his endless work, gnawing, chewing, eroding, because even eternity rots. Even the strongest tree must one day fall. The Norse accepted this with a strange calmness. They did not fight decay. They prepared for it. Odin's ravens, thought and memory, flew each dawn across Yggdrasil's branches, gathering whispers from all 9 realms. They returned at dusk, settling on his shoulders, their wings still heavy with news. But one night, they did not come back. Some said the serpent had caught them. Others said they had seen too much of the world's end and refused to return. Either way, Odin knew what it meant. The threads were tightening. The future had begun to move. If everything you built began to crumble, would you still fight to protect it? How do you stand tall when even the gods know they will fall? In the glow of their hearths, the Norse spoke of Ragnarok, not as prophecy, but as promise. The end was not to be feared, it was to be faced. Even Yggdrasil would shudder. Even the Norns' loom would burn. But from its ashes, the tree would rise again. A new world, green and untouched, would grow from its remains. The cycle would begin anew. Because for the Norse, endings were not the opposite of beginnings. They were their continuation. They believed the only immortality worth having was remembrance, to be woven into story, to be spoken of after death. And perhaps that's why their myths still live, not in temples or prayers, but in words whispered by firelight across 1,000 winters. What thread do you think you've left in the fabric of the world? And when the great tree shakes again, will your story still be told? The wind rises, the branches creak. Somewhere in the dark, the serpent stirs. And for a moment, if you close your eyes, you might almost hear it, the sound of your own fate, whispering through the leaves of the world tree. Before there were kings or kingdoms, before words or wars, there was only wind. It swept across the empty world, whispering through forests that had never heard footsteps. The gods had built the realms, forged the seas, and set the sun and moon in motion. Yet something was missing. A world without witnesses is a song no one hears. And so, beneath the shadow of Yggdrasil, the gods decided to give creation an audience. They found them by the sea, 2 pieces of driftwood lying half buried in sand. One pale and smooth like bone, the other dark and gnarled like old roots. The brothers Odin, Vili, and Ve bent down beside them. From the wood, they shaped the first humans. Odin breathed life into their still forms. Vili gave them thought, the spark of understanding, and Ve gave them form, eyes to see, tongues to speak, and hands to build. Thus were born Ask and Imbla, man and woman, the first of humankind. If you could remember your first breath, what would have felt like? To awaken in a world that had never spoken your name, would you be afraid or in awe? The gods placed them in Midgard, the realm between heaven and chaos, a bridge between the divine and the monstrous. They built walls of bones and seas around their fragile home to protect them from giants. But even the gods could not protect men from themselves. They gave them freedom, the greatest and most dangerous gift of all. For the first time, the world had eyes that could wonder, hands that could build, hearts that could love and betray in equal measure. Ask and Imbla learned hunger, curiosity, fear. They learned that warmth feels sweetest after cold, and peace feels precious only after war. The gods watched from Asgard, proud, curious, perhaps even a little envious, because in men, they saw something they had lost long ago, the possibility of becoming more than they were. Do you think the gods made us in their image, or in their mistakes? What would you have done first, if you woke up in a world made from bones and stars? Men learned quickly. They hunted and farmed, built homes of wood and stone. They lit fires that challenged the darkness, carved runes to name what they could not understand. But with every name they gave a world, they also began to shape their destiny. For to name something was to claim power over it. Still, the gods' gift of freedom came with a shadow. With thought came doubt. With love came jealousy. And with life came the promise of death. Even in their innocence, Ask and Imbla could feel it. The whisper of the Norns weaving their fate into the great tapestry. They knew that to live meant to one day return to the silence from which they had come. And yet they smiled, because to exist, even for a moment, was miracle enough. Would you want immortality, if it meant never changing? Or is it the end that makes every breath sacred? As the generations of men grew, so did their stories. They told tales of gods who watched the stars, of giants who lurked beyond the forests, of monsters born from fire and frost. In those stories, humans found courage, because if the gods could face doom, if even Odin himself feared but still acted, then so could they. The gods visited often in those early days. They taught men how to make fire, how to speak with truth, how to fight with honor. But they also taught them fear, not of punishment, but of forgetting who they were. For the gods knew that power without humility would one day destroy both worlds. What would you do if the gods walked beside you? Would you kneel, or speak as an equal? Could you look into the eyes of your creators and say, "I will write my own fate"? Men, in turn, built temples and offered sacrifices, not because they feared the gods, but because they wanted to be seen, to remind the heavens that they, too, were part of the story. Each prayer was a whisper upward through Yggdrasil's branches. Each battle, each harvest, each death was another verse in the song of creation. The gods listened. Sometimes they answered, sometimes they didn't. But even silence has meaning in a world that listens. Over time, the first humans grew old. Ask and Embla returned to the earth, their bodies feeding the same soil from which they had risen. Their children buried them with stones and songs, believing that the wind carried their spirits through Yggdrasil's leaves, back to Odin's Hall, where all stories begin again. From their legacy, humanity spread across the world. Empires would rise and fall, but the memory of their first breath, the gift of the gods, would echo through every age. Do you believe we still carry that first divine breath inside us? And if we do, what are we meant to create with it? Because in the end, the Norse never saw humans as servants of the gods. They saw them as partners in the cycle, destined to fail, to rise, to remember. The gods gave them life not to worship, but to witness, to love the fragile world they'd been given, knowing it would one day end, and to live anyway. And somewhere far above, the wind stirs through Yggdrasil again. It carries whispers of new beginnings, and perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that first breath, the moment when it became flesh and silence learned to speak. The world had grown louder. Where once only wind and waves spoke, now came the sound of steel. Men no longer whispered their prayers to the gods. They shouted them through the clash of battle and the roar of fire. The age of creation had ended. The age of heroes had begun. In these new centuries, humans walked further from the god shadow, yet closer to their fire. They hunted monsters, sailed to distant coasts, built halls where their names would be sung for generations. For the Norse believed that glory was a kind of immortality. A man's body might fall to dust, but his name, if spoken, could outlive the gods themselves. What would you trade for a name that never dies? Would you risk everything, even your soul, just to be remembered? From frostbitten valleys to iron-gray seas, new stories were born. There was Beowulf, who tore a demon limb from limb in the dark. Sigurd, who slew the dragon Fafnir and bathed in its blood, becoming almost invincible. And Brynhild, the Valkyrie who defied Odin's will for love and paid the price with fire. Each hero, each tragedy, carved another rune into the vast saga of the North. But these weren't perfect beings. They bled. They doubted. They betrayed. The Norse gods, for all their divinity, admired this, because only mortals could teach them the meaning of courage. For to be immortal was to risk nothing, but to fight knowing you would die. That was the truest form of bravery. What makes a hero? Victory, or the will to stand when you cannot win. Could you face a destiny you already knew would destroy you? In smoky halls lit by roaring fires, the skalds, the storytellers, recited the sagas of those who defied death. Their voices wove memory and myth into one. The people listened not just for entertainment, but for instruction. Each story whispered the same truth. No one escapes fate, but how you meet it defines you. The heroes of the North did not fight for paradise. They fought for honor, for legacy, for the right to stand tall before the gods when death came calling. To die without fear was to live forever in Valhalla, Odin's golden hall, where warriors feasted each night and fought each day, their wounds healing with every dawn. There, even death was only a doorway to another kind of struggle. Would you walk into death gladly, if you believe glory waited on the other side? Or is eternal struggle just another kind of cage? Yet, for all their courage, the heroes could not silence the whispers of fate. Odin's ravens saw further each year. The Norn's threads grew taut. The great serpent beneath the sea turned in its sleep. And sometimes, even in the laughter of the feasting halls, a hush would fall, as if the world itself remembered that all songs, no matter how beautiful, must end. Still, men kept fighting, because to stop would mean forgetting who they were. They built ships that sliced through storms, sailed beyond the horizon, and carved runes into stones, so their deeds would never fade. Each raid, each voyage, each act of defiance was a prayer, not to be saved, but to be seen. For in the North, the gods did not love the meek. They loved the bold, those who dared to reach higher, even when the sky burned. Do you live to be safe, or to be remembered. If you could carve one word into stone before the end, what would it be? But the greatest heroes were not only men of the sword. Some battled within, against pride, greed, and the shadows of their own hearts. Because the Norse knew that the fiercest war was not fought on the battlefield. It was fought inside the soul. The man who conquered himself, they said, could conquer the world. As years passed, the line between men and gods blurred. Some heroes were lifted into the heavens, honored in the constellations. Others were cursed, their stories twisted by those who feared them. Because every tale of greatness carries a warning. The higher you climb, the closer you come to falling. The gods watched these mortals rise with both pride and unease. Odin saw reflections of his own hunger for knowledge in them. Thor saw his strength multiplied in their courage. Even Loki smiled, because he knew that heroes, like him, were creatures of chaos, half noble, half doomed. And yet, in their rise, the gods also saw prophecy, for it was said that when men became too much like the gods, the end of both would begin. Can greatness exist without destruction? Or is every triumph just another spark that feeds the fire of the end? So the heroes of the North fought on, against giants, against beasts, against fate itself. They built a world of honor, blood, and memory. And when their time came, they stepped into the storm without hesitation, for to live without fear was to be worthy of song. Their stories did not promise salvation. They promised something rarer, meaning the kind that burns brighter because it ends, the kind that still whispers through the long nights, reminding us that courage was once the language of the North, and that every life, no matter how small, is another verse in the great saga of the world. When the last song is sung, will your story be a whisper or a war cry? The heroes had sung their songs, shed their blood, and filled the world with names. But names, like embers, fade unless they are fanned into flame. And so from the ashes of legends, a new hunger was born, not for glory, but for rule. Men began to crown themselves, and in their veins, they claimed flowed the blood of gods. The age of wandering was ending. Villages became halls, halls became strongholds, and strongholds became kingdoms. Steel and oath built walls around the world. The sword hand that once swung for honor now swung for dominion. If your ancestors were gods, what would you believe you deserved? Would you rule with justice or with fire? In the North, kings rose not by divine decree, but by proof. No crown could rest on an untested head. A king had to lead the shield wall, to bleed beside his men. He earned his throne through courage, not lineage, because in this land, even royalty had to earn the right to die well. But power, once seized, breeds its own storm. The sagas tell of brother slaying brother. For a throne, no one could keep warm for long. Alliances sworn in mead turned to betrayal at dawn. The gods, watching from Asgard, saw in these new kings a mirror of themselves, proud, restless, doomed. Do you think power changes people, or merely reveals what they were all along? How many crowns have been built from the bones of friends? One king, Harald Fairhair, vowed he would not cut his hair until he ruled all of Norway. For 10 years, he fought war after war, uniting lands soaked in blood. When at last he stood victorious, he washed his hair in the sea and bound it in gold. But the same sea that crowned him would later swallow his sons, each hungering for his throne. The gods laughed, because they knew that mortals, like them, could never share power peacefully. Others claimed descent from Odin himself, divine blood, they said, burning within mortal flesh. They built dynasties upon the illusion of eternity. But the Norse understood the cruel joke hidden in that claim. Even the gods were not immortal in the truest sense. Their doom was written, and so was man's. Would you still chase immortality if it meant inheriting a god's fate? To live long enough to watch everything you love burn? Or would you rather die forgotten, but free? Kings ruled with a sword in one hand and story in the other. Because in the North, no throne stood without song. Every ruler hired skalds to carve his legend into words. to ensure his story would outlive his body. But the skalds, too, were dangerous, for their words could immortalize or erase. One insult from a poet could undo a lifetime of conquest. It was said that in the north, a sharp tongue could wound deeper than a blade. Among the gods, Odin watched with quiet fascination. He saw how men mirrored divine ambition, how they built halls like Valhalla, and ruled with the same mixture of wisdom and cruelty. Perhaps, he thought, this was the true purpose of creation. Not worship, but reflection. Men were the gods' legacy, and their warning. When you build your own kingdom, even if it's only in your mind, do you rule with fear or with wisdom? Can power ever be held without corruption? Or is it always borrowed from chaos? As kings rose, so did kingdoms. Trade replaced raiding, law replaced vengeance. But beneath the new order, something older still whispered, the call of blood and storm. The same hunger that drove the first longships still lived in men's hearts. Civilization was only frost upon the surface of a frozen sea. Beneath it, the tide of violence waited, patient and sure. And when those tides broke, as they always did, men prayed again to Odin, to Thor, to the old gods they once thought they had outgrown. Because no matter how high they built their walls, they could not outbuild sky. One by one, kingdoms fell to the same truth the gods had learned long ago. Power cannot be kept, only borrowed, only tested, only burned through and passed on. A crown was never a promise. It was a reminder that every ruler, no matter how mighty, serves the same master in the end. Fate. What do you think lasts longer, power or story? When your kingdom crumbles, will your name still echo in the wind? As the fires of kingship spread, the world entered its next turning. The gods' laughter faded. The sea grew restless again. And in the far distance, somewhere beyond the horizon, sails began to rise. Long, narrow, silent. The kind that carried not kings, but conquerors. The blood of gods had given birth to kings. Now kings would give birth to empires. And with them, the world would tremble once more. The wind howls across the northern sea, cold enough to flay the skin from bone. Yet through the mist and frost, something moves, long shadows, sleek and low, slicing through the waves. They are not beasts, though they breathe like dragons. They are longships, the veins of the Viking world, pumping blood and fire into every shore they touch. To the Norse, the longship was more than wood and iron. It was freedom shaped into form. It was the difference between surviving winter and conquering the horizon. Each plank carved with care, each nail driven with purpose. A floating hall of warriors, carrying not only men, but destiny. Have you ever stood before the open sea and felt it calling your name? If you could go anywhere, no map, no promise of return, would you take the oar? The builders of these ships were not craftsmen. They were magicians. They carved hulls from oak that could bend but never break. The keels curved like serpents, allowing them to ride the waves instead of fighting them. Their shallow drafts let them slip into rivers, glide over shoals, and strike where no army could defend. Wind in their square sails carried them like spirits. When the wind died, the oars took over, dozens of hands rowing as one heartbeat. Each ship had a soul. The Norse named them as they would a child, the wave stallion, sea serpent, wind eater. A man could love his ship more than his home, for on its deck, he felt closest to the gods. For the sea was not a barrier, it was a mirror, showing men who they truly were when nothing else remained. Do you think the sea still remembers the names whispered into its waves? What would you name your own ship if it could carry you anywhere, even into the unknown? Every expedition began in silence. Men gathered beneath dawn's gray light, breath steaming, armor creaking. They touched the carved dragon head at the prow, not as superstition, but as pact. The sea demanded respect. One careless word could turn wind into curse. For out there were no kings, no laws, only the endless shifting blue. And yet, they went willingly, because to the Norse, danger was not deterrent, it was invitation. They believed the gods loved those who defied the impossible, and so they set out into storms others feared, chasing not only plunder, but the feeling of being alive at the edge of the world. The longship made every man equal. The king and the farmer rode side by side, their fates tied to the same rhythm. Each stroke of the oar said the same thing: we move together, or we die alone. No castle on land could build such unity. No prayer could buy such trust. It was forged by salt, sweat, and shared silence. Could you live like that, shoulder to shoulder, with no walls, no escape, only the horizon ahead? Would you survive the sea, or become part of it? By day, they rode until their arms burned. By night, they slept beneath the stars, their ship rocking gently like a cradle of iron. Some said they could hear Odin's ravens in the wind, whispering of wars to come. Others swore that when the northern lights danced above, they were the souls of fallen sailors, lighting the way for those still breathing. Every voyage blurred the line between life and myth, and perhaps that was the point. The longship changed the world. It turned raiders into traders, outcasts into kings. With it, the Norse reached lands no one else dared, across the North Sea, into the rivers of Russia, even to the distant shores of the New World. Every coast that heard their oars became part of their story, a story written not in ink, but in waves and fear. Can you imagine what it felt like to see those dragon-headed prows rising through the mist, knowing the world you knew was ending? Would you flee, or stand and watch the storm arrive? Even their enemies learned to listen for that sound, the slow, steady beat of oars in the fog, a heartbeat of conquest, approaching unseen. Some called it invasion, others called it destiny, but for the Norse, it was simply the way of the world, to move, to take, to return richer or die trying. Each voyage was a prayer to the sea, whispered in sweat, paid in blood. When a ship went down, the waves swallowed it whole, carrying its crew into the deep halls of Aegir, the sea giant. There, it was said, they feasted forever in flickering underwater firelight, their laughter echoing through coral walls. The sea gave and took as it pleased, and that, too, was sacred. When the first longship returned home, heavy with silver and slaves, its dragon head was covered with cloth, not out of shame, but reverence. The spirit of the ship had seen too much. It had crossed worlds men were not meant to see, and so, like a sleeping god, it was veiled until the next voyage. If your ship carried every dream you've ever had, how many storms could it survive before breaking? Would you still sail, knowing the ocean remembers everything it swallows? The longship was not only the engine of Norse expansion, it was the soul of their civilization, a symbol of what they feared most, and what they loved most, the vast, indifferent freedom of the sea. And when the last of them rotted away, the North did not forget. Even now, when waves crash against lonely cliffs, it sounds almost like oars, as if somewhere, out beyond the fog, the old fleet still rose toward eternity. Dawn broke cold and red over the North Sea. The waves rolled like iron, and from that iron came dragons. Sails striped in blood and ash swelled against the wind, longships, their prows carved into beasts that grinned at the horizon. They moved with a terrible grace, swift and silent until the last moment. The world below still slept, unaware that history itself was about to awaken. Imagine standing on that coast, hearing oars before you saw them. Would you believe they were ships or monsters? Would you run, or wait to see what crawled out of the mist? Their destination was not chosen by chance. It was a small island off the coast of Northumbria, known to its monks as Lindisfarne, a place of prayer, of peace, of faith. The holy island had no walls. Why would it? Its inhabitants believed they were protected by God. But that morning, June 8th, 793 AD, the gods of the north came instead. The longships grounded softly on the sand, their keels barely disturbing the tide. Dozens of warriors leapt ashore, axes gleaming, shields painted in red spirals and black ravens. They moved not like savages, but like soldiers, practiced, purposeful, silent until the first strike fell. The monks heard the bell ring, They thought it was the call to prayer. It was the alarm of doom. Can you picture it? Sacred silence, shattered by the scream of steel? When faith meets fury, which do you think breaks first? The raiders moved through the monastery like wind through grass. They knew exactly where to go. The church treasury, the reliquary, the scriptorium where gold and ink were bound together. They tore jeweled covers from holy books, ripped crosses from walls, and dragged trembling monks into the courtyard. The sea breeze carried the smell of blood and salt, mingling as if the ocean itself approved. For the Norse, this was not sacrilege. It was strategy. They did not see gods in stone. They saw silver. They believed that wealth belonged to those strong enough to claim it. And so they took it, every coin, every chalice, every life that could be sold or spared. What would you pray for in that moment? Salvation or invisibility? Could you forgive men who believed they were chosen by their own strength? When it was over, the monastery burned. Smoke curled into the morning sky like a signal fire to heaven. The world you knew is ending. The age of isolation is dead. The age of the Vikings has begun. Word of the massacre spread like plague. Messengers galloped through kingdoms, bearing news that sounded more like myth than report. Barbarians from the sea, they said, demons in longships. Even the great Charlemagne trembled when he heard, not for his armies, but for his soul. For the first time in living memory, the Christian world faced a foe that feared neither death nor damnation. The Norse did not beg for mercy because they did not believe in it. They did not raid to convert or to conquer, but to prove their strength, their courage, their right to exist beyond the edge of fear. What happens when faith meets a people who do not fear your God? Is power still power when your enemy doesn't play by your rules? From Lindisfarne, the Longships fanned outward like fire across dry grass. The Irish coasts, the Hebrides, the Frankish ports, each fell in turn. No pattern, no warning, only the sound of the sea, then the scream of steel. Europe learned a new kind of terror, one that arrived without prophecy or plan. And yet, behind the chaos, there was intelligence. The raids were fast, precise, and organized. This was not madness, it was method. The Norse had found their model. Strike hard, strike fast, vanish before vengeance. Each successful raid brought more wealth, more ships, more volunteers eager for glory. The cycle had begun, self-feeding, unstoppable. Would you have joined them if it meant escaping hunger and obscurity? If every voyage promised either silver or a hero's death, how would you choose? In their longhouses, the raiders told their tales by firelight. They spoke of the terror in the monks' eyes, of gold that melted like sunlight in their hands, of seas that sang beneath them. They believed they were chosen, not by gods of mercy, but by fate itself. And fate, they thought, was smiling. But across the sea, the survivors whispered different prayers. They called the Northmen heathens, devils, wolves in human skin. They cursed them, feared them, and yet they could not deny their strength. For deep down, they sensed a truth too frightening to speak. The Norse were not coming to destroy civilization. They were coming to replace it. When you look at the sea now, do you still see beauty? Or do you see memory? How many times has the world ended, only to be born again in fire? As the last embers of Lindisfarne faded into night, the raiders raised their sails and vanished into the mist. Behind them, the monastery's bell hung cracked and silent, a relic of a faith that believed it could not be touched. But the sea remembers every scream, and the wind carries stories farther than prayers ever could. The first raid was over. The age of innocence had drowned, and Europe, still bleeding, had not yet realized. This was only the beginning. After Lindisfarne, the sea did not rest. Its waves carried whispers, then rumors, then terror. From the cliffs of Ireland to the rocky shores of Francia, one name began to travel faster than any ship. The Northman, a word that turned blood cold, even under summer sun. Monks wrote it in trembling ink. Merchants spoke it in low tones, as if to say it aloud would summon sails on the horizon. And kings, Kings who feared nothing on land began to fortify their coasts and pray to a god who suddenly seemed very far away. Have you ever felt safety vanish? Not with a scream, but with silence? How would you sleep, knowing the next sunrise could bring fire from the sea? They came first for the edges of the world, the islands, the lonely monasteries, the river mouths. Then they came for the heart. Ireland burned. Iona, once holy ground, was drowned in blood. Along the Seine and Loire, longships slid through morning mist like blades through flesh. The rivers became their highways. No place was safe, not even the cities behind walls, for the Norse were not soldiers. They were storms. Their ships struck without pattern or warning. A village one day, a market the next. Sometimes they came in spring, sometimes in autumn. Sometimes they took gold, sometimes they took people, and sometimes they left nothing at all. Can you imagine hearing a horn in the fog, not knowing if it was the wind or death calling? Would you run, hide, fight, or just wait for the sound to stop? Europe was not ready. Its armies were built for land wars, its kings for diplomacy, its faith for eternity, not immediacy. The Norse moved too fast for prayer to catch up. Their longships were ghosts, their warriors shadows. By the time word reached the next town, the raiders were already gone, or worse, already there. In Francia, Charlemagne himself wept when he saw Norse sails near his coasts. The emperor who had broken kingdoms and crowned popes now faced an enemy he could not see, could not predict, could not even understand. How do you fight an army that does not seek to rule, but only to return, again and again from the sea? And behind each raid came something more dangerous than steel memory, the memory of helplessness, the kind that infects a continent, the kind that makes people believe the gods have abandoned them. Do you think fear spreads faster than fire? What happens to faith when even prayer begins to sound like panic? Across monasteries and castles, the stories grew, of ships with dragon heads that breathed smoke, of men who fought like wolves and laughed while dying, of women with painted faces who screamed prophecies before battle. The tales grew larger than life, but the terror they described was real. The Norse themselves did nothing to quiet these rumors. They encouraged them. Fear was a weapon sharper than any axe. The next village that heard they were coming might flee before the first sword was drawn. A terrified enemy saves you the trouble of fighting him. It was psychological warfare, centuries before the word existed. A theater of terror played out on the edge of every sea. Would you rather face an enemy who kills you, or one who makes you fear living? What would you give to never hear that sound again? The creak of oars in the fog. But not all who sailed under the Raven banner sought only destruction. Some came to trade, to explore, to settle. In Ireland, they built the first version of Dublin. In Francia, they married into noble families. Yet wherever they went, they carried the same paradox. Builders and breakers, pagans and poets, conquerors who still prayed to the wind. Europe could not decide whether to destroy them or become them. By the mid-9th century, kingdoms began to adapt. Towers rose along rivers. Bells were cast not only for prayer, but for warning. Coastal watchfires flickered through the night, sending signals inland. It was too late to stop the Norse, but not too late to learn from them. Even in terror, civilization evolves. When threatened, do you fortify your walls or your heart? Which survives longer, a kingdom, or the people who remember its fall? Still, the raids continued, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. Back home, population and ambition had outgrown the fjords. The sea offered what the land could not: wealth, fame, freedom. And each successful raid fed the next. The sons of raiders became chieftains. Their names became legends. The world was opening, and the Norse were its first explorers. But in the monasteries and cities they left behind, the prayers grew darker, not for mercy anymore, but for vengeance, for a way to strike back against the gods of the sea. And in that vengeance, Europe began to change. What do you think fear creates? Despair or evolution? Can terror, once unleashed, ever truly be tamed? The Norse had no intention of stopping. To them, conquest was not cruelty. It was proof that life belonged to those who dared to take it. And so, every tide brought new sails, new warriors, new legends. From Lindisfarne to Paris, from Ireland to Iberia, the same story repeated. The sea opened, the world bled, and the gods, if they were watching, stayed silent. The raids had begun as acts of survival. They had become acts of domination. And soon, they would become something far greater. A system, an empire, a way of life. When fear becomes tradition, can it still be called fear? Or has it simply become history repeating itself? Louder this time? The wind shifted, the waves darkened, the horizon filled with sails. And Europe, for all its prayers, had not yet learned how to fight the storm. The North was coming, and the world was only beginning to understand what that meant. The rivers of Francia ran quiet that spring, too quiet. Fishermen spoke of strange tides. Merchants whispered of vanished boats. And then, one mist-shrouded dawn, the bells of Paris rang not for prayer, but for panic. From the fog rose sails, dozens, then hundreds, each one marked with the black raven of Odin. The sea had found its way inland. Can you imagine standing on a city wall and seeing the river itself turn to iron and flame? Would you pray for deliverance, or reach for your sword? It was the year 845 AD. At their head sailed a man the chronicles named Ragnar Lodbrok, half legend, half storm, a warlord draped in wolfskin, eyes sharp as frost, said to have slain serpents, kings, and even time itself. His fleet moved up the Seine like a living serpent, coils tightening around the heart of Francia. Paris was not ready. Its walls were strong, but its spirit was untested. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, gathered his forces, vowing to stop the Norse tide. Yet the Vikings did not charge blindly. They moved like craftsmen, patient, precise. They burned villages along the river to choke the city's supplies, turned bridges into traps, and made the Seine itself their weapon. For 3 days, the sky darkened with smoke. For 3 nights, screams echoed from the banks. The Franks fought bravely, but they were landmen, and the Vikings were born of water. They struck from ships that seemed to vanish into the mist after every raid. Even the horses panicked at the smell of salt and fire. How does it feel to fight an enemy who moves like weather? Impossible to predict, impossible to stop. Would you stand your ground, or follow the river's current and flee? When the Norse finally reached the city's gates, they did not storm them. They surrounded Paris instead, cutting off every road, every ferry, every escape. Inside, famine and fear began their slow work. The city was trapped, not by siege towers or engines, but by silence. For weeks, the only sound was the creak of longships at anchor and the distant cry of ravens circling the dead. Ragnar knew he did not need to destroy Paris. He only needed to make the king believe he could, and that belief was worth more than silver. The Frankish army, unable to break through, began to wither. Sickness spread through the streets. Desperation replaced faith, and as the smoke thickened, the people of Paris began to see the Northmen not as men, but as gods of ruin. Finally, Charles the Bald sent envoys under a white flag. They carried gold, jewels, and promises of peace. Ragnar met them on the riverbank, smiling like a man who already knew the ending. He demanded a Dane geld, a ransom not for conquest, but for restraint. 7,000 pounds of silver. The sum was staggering, enough to build 10 cities, or burn one brighter. What would you pay to make the storm pass you by? Can peace bought with gold ever last? Or does it only invite the next storm? The ransom was paid. Ragnar's fleet loaded their treasure, raised their sails, and drifted back down the Seine. Not retreating, but teaching, for the Franks had learned a cruel truth that day. Sometimes the price of survival is the illusion of victory. When Ragnar's ships vanished beyond the horizon, Paris counted itself spared. But word spread faster than the tide. Every chieftain across the north heard the same story. That gold flowed from the south, like spring meltwater. That fear itself was a kind of currency. and that the rivers of Europe were open roads to glory. If the world rewarded your violence with wealth, would you ever stop? When does survival become conquest, and conquest become addiction? The siege of Paris changed everything. It proved that no city, no king, no God's protection could hold back the North, and it marked a turning point from raiding to ruling. For when men realize they can buy empires without holding them, power itself becomes a trade. In the sagas, they say Ragnar returned home and laughed as he tossed gold across the hall. He called it the ransom of fear. His laughter echoed through history, long after his bones turned to dust. But France did not forget. It built towers higher, walls thicker, prayers louder. Yet none of it could erase the memory of that morning, when the river itself became an enemy. When you look at a river today, do you see peace or a path invasion once traveled? Do you think history forgets the sound of oars once it learns the cost of silver? The North had discovered Europe's weakness, its wealth, its faith, its belief that the sea was a border instead of a bridge. And as the Longships returned to their fjords, the men who rowed them smiled. They had not just raided a city, they had raided certainty. From that day forward, no ruler in Europe could look at the water without wondering what slept beyond the fog. And for the Norse, the rivers still whispered the same promise. Where the gold flows, the gods follow. The siege was over, but the world had changed forever. Winter had always been the North's oldest enemy. It killed the careless, tested the strong, and swallowed the unprepared. But by the mid-9th century, the Vikings learned to make even winter serve them. Where others saw the end of campaigning, the Norse saw an opportunity to stay. What would you do if the land you came to conquer began to feel like home? Would you return to your past, or build a new future from stolen soil? For generations, the rhythm had been the same. Spring raids, summer wars, autumn voyages home. But now, the Longships stayed beached when the first snow fell. The warriors built fires instead of sailing away. They drove stakes into frozen ground and raised walls of timber and turf. These were not fleeting encampments anymore. They were foundations. They called them Vitarlager, winter camps. From these strongholds, the Norse launched raids when the rivers thawed and traded when they froze. What began as temporary shelters grew into fortified settlements. Half barracks, half towns, places where the line between raider and resident began to blur. Can you picture it? The sound of hammers replacing the clash of swords? A village rising from the same ashes it once set alight? The first great camp rose on the island of Seine around 850 AD. Dozens of longhouses clustered near the river, smoke curling into gray skies. Around them, wooden palisades stood like ribs around a new beast being born. Inside, warriors feasted, smiths forged weapons, and slaves rebuilt what had been destroyed. It was not peace. It was preparation. The locals watched from afar, half terrified, half fascinated, because these invaders did something no one expected. They built. They traded amber and furs for wine and wheat. They repaired churches to use as storehouses. They buried their dead in the same soil as the men they'd slain. And slowly, inevitably, they began to stay. How do you tell when conquest ends and settlement begins? Is it when the sword rusts, or when a child is born beneath it? For the Norse, this was not surrender. It was strategy. They realized that by living among their enemies, they could own the land without ruling it. Their camps became marketplaces, then fortresses, then cities, each one another thread in a growing web stretching across Europe. Ireland felt it first. The raiders who once burned monasteries now anchored their ships in harbors, building the foundations of Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. These began as trading outposts and grew into bustling ports. From these harbors, silver, silk, and slaves flowed north, feeding an economy born of both terror and opportunity. The very places that had cursed the Vikings now depended on them. Would you trade with the same hands that once held your chains? How long does it take for fear to become habit? In Francia, winter camps became permanent bases. The Vikings no longer needed to vanish with the tide. The tide now served them. They learned the local languages, took local wives, and raised children who spoke both Norse and Frankish. Their gods shared space with the cross. Their sagas mingled with Christian chronicles. The storm had not ended. It had simply changed shape. Odin's ravens, it was said, flew lower that winter, confused. Were these men still warriors, or something new entirely? Even the gods must have wondered. Some Viking leaders began to see beyond raiding. Why plunder when you could own? Why burn a city when you could tax it? And why worship distant gods when your power already reached as far as their myths? Is this how civilizations are born? Not in triumph, but in exhaustion? When the fire that once destroyed finally decides to warm instead. Yet not all agreed. To some, settling was betrayal, softening of spirit, dilution of blood. The younger warriors mocked the elders who built homes, calling them farmers in armor. But the truth was deeper. The Norse were evolving. They were no longer outsiders. They were becoming a part of the very world they had once sought to break. And Europe, whether it wanted to or not, began to change with them. New words entered old tongues. New gods shared old temples. New blood ran through ancient veins. And across the continent, the boundaries between us and them began to dissolve into something unrecognizable. Not peace, but fusion. If your enemy becomes your neighbor, does he stop being your enemy? Or is peace just another form of war, slower and quieter? By the end of that first great winter, the Norse had proven something remarkable. They could survive not only battle, but belonging. They had conquered not just with swords, but with endurance. The snow melted, the rivers thawed, the ships were dragged back into the water, their hulls scarred but strong. And as they sailed again toward new horizons, they left behind more than graves. They left beginnings. The North had stopped coming and going. Now it was here to stay. The storm had broken, but it did not fade. It settled. Where the sea once roared, now came the sound of hammers. Where villages had burned, children now played. And where once there had been the Norse and the Franks, the Irish, the Saxons, there were now simply families. Can you imagine growing up in a land your father conquered and your mother once called home? Would you inherit his axe or her prayers? In the camps that had become towns, a new generation was being born. Children of two worlds, hair pale as the northern snows, eyes dark as the southern earth. They spoke two tongues and belonged fully to neither. To their fathers, they were heirs. To their mothers, reminders. To the world, they were the future. The Northmen had stopped coming and started staying. Their ships now rested on riverbanks, their sails patched with memories. They still told stories of thunder gods and sea kings, but in the same breath, they crossed themselves before sleeping. Faith, like blood, had begun to mingle. How do you pray when you have two gods listening? Can belief ever be pure once it's shared? These new families did what the sword never could. They rooted. They turned foreign soil into home. The women taught them farming, weaving language. The men brought ironwork, navigation, and songs of the North. Together, they created something that neither side had planned. A hybrid civilization built on both conquest and compassion. In Ireland, Norse markets buzzed with traders and craftsmen. Where monks once whispered psalms, merchants now called out prices in 3 languages. In Francia, Viking words began to slip into the local speech. Husband, window, law, sky, knife. Each one a small invasion of language, each one permanent. Even words, it seemed, could conquer. What do you think lasts longer? The blood in your veins, or the words you leave behind? If your language became someone else's story, would you call that victory or surrender? In Normandy, the transformation was complete. Norse chieftains began calling themselves dukes, not raiders. Their children learned to write Latin, to kneel in cathedrals, to rule by law rather than by raid. But behind every sermon and treaty, the fire of the old gods still smoldered. Odin might be whispered as our father. Thor might be remembered in a cross's thunderbolt. The past never vanished, it adapted. Europe, exhausted by war, began to accept this new reality. The Northmen were no longer strangers, they were neighbors. They brought not just swords, but ships, trade, and technology. Their settlements became bridges between worlds, between pagan and Christian, between old Europe and the new. When two enemies build a house together, who owns it? Can peace ever be equal? Or is it just the silence between storms? Among the settlers, a quiet transformation unfolded. The sons of raiders grew restless, but not for plunder. They wanted land, law, legacy. They looked not to the sea for their destiny, but to the soil. Some became farmers, others knights, and a few kings. The saga of blood and fire was giving way to one of inheritance and identity. Yet, even in peace, the old hunger whispered. The sons still dreamed of the horizon. They still built ships. They still felt the pulse of the ocean, like an ancient memory stirring in their bones. The gods of the north were not dead. They simply waited beneath the waves. Do you think the call of adventure ever truly dies? Or does it just sleep inside the quiet life we build around it? The daughters of both worlds carried the future in their arms. They sang lullabies in mixed tongues, half prayer, half spell, to children who would one day shape kingdoms. They taught them to respect both fire and frost, both sword and song. These children would not call themselves Norse or Frankish. They would call themselves something new. From their blood would rise new dynasties, dukes of Normandy, kings of England, explorers who would one day follow the sea west to unknown lands. Each carried within them a fragment of the Old North, the courage to leave, the will to build, the knowledge that the world could always be remade. If your ancestors conquered the world, what would you conquer next? Your fear, your fate, or your own reflection? Do you carry their fire, or are you just keeping it warm for someone else? By the time the old raiders grew gray, they no longer dreamed of burning cities. They dreamed of their children, playing beside the rivers they had once drenched in blood, growing crops where graves had been, speaking of gods no one had seen, but all still felt. The longships rotted into the mud. The axes rusted. The sagas became stories told softly to sleeping children, and the world at last began to heal. But history, like the tide, always returns. The sons of the settlers would one day rise again, not with torches, but with banners, not as raiders, but as rulers, and their father's fire would burn anew, not in destruction, but in empire. Can peace survive the memory of conquest? Or is every lull in history just the breath before another storm? The North had given the world its warriors. Now it would give it its kings. They came to raid and stayed to rule. By the early 10th century, the Norse no longer arrived as ghosts on the river. They lived there. Their longships were beached, their swords rusting beside plows. But their ambition, that never rusted. It only changed shape. The land they had burned now bore their name, Normandy, the land of the Northmen. A name once whispered in fear, now spoken with authority. Where monasteries once smoldered, churches rose under new hands. And where Viking warlords had once shouted across battlefields, their sons now spoke Latin in courts. The raiders had become rulers. If your ancestors were conquerors, can you ever escape their shadow? Or is power simply another inheritance, like blood or sin? The man who began it all was Rollo, a chieftain too restless for one homeland, too ambitious for one god. After years of raiding along the Seine, he realized what his ancestors never had. You could hold a sword for a moment, or you could hold land forever. In 911 AD, standing before the Frankish king Charles the Simple, Rollo made history not by battle, but by bargain. He agreed to defend the kingdom's northern coast against future Viking attacks in exchange for land, vast, fertile land, and a title, Duke of Normandy. He sealed the pact with an oath of loyalty, but when told to kneel and kiss the king's foot, Rollo refused. He ordered one of his warriors to do it instead, and the man, too proud for submission, lifted the king's leg so high the monarch toppled backward. The court gasped. The Vikings laughed, and thus Normandy was born, not in reverence, but in defiance. What would you trade for peace? Your pride or your power? Can respect be built on fear, or only on equality? Rollo ruled not as a barbarian, but as a bridge. He baptized himself into Christianity, taking the name Robert, but kept the old gods close in memory. Odin beneath the cross, Thor behind every thunderstorm. He divided land among his warriors, enforced laws, built fortresses and churches. He understood something few warlords ever did. That true strength is not in destruction, but in what you build after it. Normandy thrived. Its harbors filled with ships once used for raiding, now heavy with trade. Its warriors became knights. Its storytellers became chroniclers. In one generation, the wolf had learned to wear a crown. Do you think civilization is just conquest that learned patience? Can savagery and sophistication truly live in the same heart? Rollo's descendants expanded what he began. They spoke French, but dreamed in Norse. They prayed to Christ, but still felt the pull of the sea. They married local nobles, blending Viking boldness with Frankish diplomacy, creating a new kind of leader, disciplined, daring, and dangerously ambitious. By the 11th century, Normandy was no longer a frontier. It was a powerhouse. Its dukes ruled with precision, its armies trained with discipline, and its people believed in destiny. In their stone halls, the air hummed with the old northern spirit, the belief that fate favors the bold. If your blood remembers both axe and altar, which will guide your hand? Can you serve two masters, faith and fire, without being torn apart? The Normans became Europe's most formidable soldiers. Their descendants carried their restless energy across the seas, to Italy, to Byzantium, to England. Everywhere they went, they brought the same contradiction, the order of kings and the hunger of raiders. And the world, once terrified of them, now paid them tribute not out of fear, but admiration. In the eyes of history, Normandy became something rare, a civilization forged from collision. It was neither purely Norse nor purely French. It was the child of violence and vision. It remembered the fury of the sea, but built its power on the steadiness of the land. Its people still sang of Valhalla, but they sang those songs in cathedrals. What does it mean to evolve? To change your nature, or to master it? When the wolf learns to speak the language of kings, does he stop being a wolf? Rollo died an old man, rare among men of his kind. He was buried not in a burning ship, but in a stone church beneath a carved cross. Yet the wind outside his tomb still howled like the fjords of home, and waves on Normandy's coast still carried the same rhythm as the oars that had brought him there. Generations later, his bloodline would rise again, a duke named William, descendant of Rollo, who would cross another sea and change the destiny of Europe forever. But that story, the story of the conquest of England, was still to come. For now, Normandy stood, a living monument to transformation, a kingdom born of invasion, sustained by adaptation. Is history written by those who conquer, or those who learn to stay? Can a civilization built by fire ever escape its smoke? The ravens had flown south and made their nests in stone towers. The sea still called, but the shore was no longer afraid. And from the ashes of chaos, the North had finally learned the most dangerous power of all, patience. The Vikings had once ruled the waves. Now their sons ruled the world. History loves a circle. 2 centuries after the Longships first came screaming across the North Sea, they returned, not for plunder, but for a crown. The land that had once prayed for deliverance from the North was now about to be ruled by it, and the man leading them was William, Duke of Normandy, great-great-grandson of Rollo, the Viking who once refused to kneel. Have you ever felt the weight of your ancestors watching you? What would you do if destiny itself called your name across the sea? The year was 1066. England stood uncertain. Its king, Edward the Confessor, had died without an heir. 3 men claimed the throne: Harold, Godwin, son of England, Harold Hardrada of Norway, and William of Normandy. Each claimed legitimacy. Each claimed God's favor. But only one carried the blood of the North and the patience of a century behind him. William was no barbarian. He ruled with discipline, forged alliances with Rome and the Frankish Church, and gathered one of the greatest invasion fleets the medieval world had ever seen. But make no mistake, inside him, the sea still spoke. The same spirit that once rode through storms now commanded nations. Can civilization truly tame the wildness it's built upon? Or does the hunger that created it always find its way back to the surface? When the wind finally turned favorable that September, William gave the order. Hundreds of ships, their sails striped red and gold, crossed the channel under a harvest moon. They carried knights instead of raiders, bishops instead of berserkers. But beneath the polished armor and banners of Christ still beat the same heart, the Viking heart. On the English coast, Harold Godwin's son had just defeated another invader, the Norse king Harald Hardrada, at the bloody Battle of Stamford Bridge. The fields of Yorkshire were still warm with blood when he learned that William had landed in the south. Exhausted, his army marched the length of England to face yet another storm. Have you ever won a battle only to realize the war has just begun? How much can one man's will withstand before it breaks? On October 14th, 1066, the two armies met near Hastings. The sky hung heavy with mist and prophecy. English shields locked tight along a hill, forming an iron wall. Norman cavalry waited below, hooves trembling with energy. For hours, they clashed, spears against swords, arrows against shields, flesh against fate. Each side believed God was theirs. William's horse was struck down mid-battle. Rumors spread that he was dead, until he ripped off his helmet and shouted to his men, "I live, and by this sign we shall conquer." It was not just a rally. It was a resurrection of every raider who had ever crossed the sea before him. Can one man's certainty bend the arc of history? Or is destiny simply the courage to keep standing when others fall? When Harold was struck by an arrow, legend says through the eye, the English shield wall finally broke. The field became a slaughterhouse of history. By nightfall, England was lost, and William, the Duke of Normandy, became William the Conqueror. The circle had closed. The descendants of Vikings now sat upon the throne of the very kingdom their ancestors once raided. From that moment, the fate of England and of Europe would never be the same. The language, the law, even the bloodlines of the island changed forever. Old England died on that hill. A new one was born under the sword of the North. What would you have done if you stood there that day, on the losing side, watching your world vanish? Would you remember your defeat as a wound, or as the beginning of something new? William ruled not with the chaos of his ancestors, but with their memory. He built castles instead of pyres. He taxed, recorded, and organized. He made order his weapon. The Doomsday Book, his census of everything and everyone, was not just an administrative act. It was domination in ink. Where once his forefathers took by axe, he took by pen. The Norse thirst for control had finally become civilization itself. But the echo of the sea never truly left him. Every night, the waves outside Normandy whispered, reminding him that empires, like tides, always retreat someday. Do you think conquest ever ends? Or does it simply change its language? When you build a kingdom on bones, how long before it begins to whisper? By the time William died in 1087, his empire stretched across England and Normandy, a bridge of power connecting the island and the continent, the sword and the quill, the past and the future. He was buried not in a ship, but in a cathedral, yet the wind that blew through its halls carried the same salt scent of the sea, the smell of everything his people had ever conquered and become. The Viking Age had ended, but its shadow had only just begun. When the roar of battle faded at Hastings, silence did not bring peace. It brought construction. The sword had won the crown, but the stone would keep it. William the Conqueror understood that to hold a land, you must change its skyline, its language, and its soul. What would you build if you wanted the world to remember your victory forever? A statue, a city, or an empire carved in stone? Across England, The sound of hammers replaced that of horns. Everywhere, castles rose, cold, gray monuments to fear and control. The Tower of London, begun in 1078, loomed over the Thames like a northern god made solid. Its white walls glittered with Norman ambition, a fortress, a palace, and a warning. Each stone was both prayer and threat. We're here to stay. The English, still haunted by memory of the Viking raids, watched as the descendants of those same raiders built fortresses upon their land. The conquerors no longer came by sea. They came through taxes, decrees, and divine right. The North had traded its axes for architecture. Do you think power feels different when it's built instead of taken? Or is every castle just a raid that never ends? William divided England among his Norman barons, his new lords of loyalty. They built keeps and modern bailey strongholds across the countryside, a network of stone teeth biting into English soil. Each fortress symbolized both fear and progress, an inheritance of conquest turned into civilization. The language changed too. French became the speech of the court, Latin the tongue of the law, and Old English retreated to the cottages and fields. The word freedom itself was reshaped. Now it meant obedience to a distant crown. But languages, like people, adapt. Over centuries, they blended, birthing Middle English, a child of two worlds, carrying the rhythm of the North and the poetry of the South. It was from this hybrid tongue that Chaucer would one day write, and Shakespeare would later dream. If your conqueror gave you a new language, would you resist it, or make it your own? Can a word carry rebellion and obedience at the same time? Religion, too, bent to this new order. The Normans rebuilt the ruined churches of England not as sanctuaries, but as symbols of divine authority. The cathedrals at Durham, Ely, and Winchester rose like mountains of faith and pride. Their arches reached toward heaven, but their foundations were heavy with conquest. Every stone whispered a paradox, that peace could be enforced, and salvation could come through subjugation. The Normans brought with them the Romanesque style, massive, rounded, unyielding. It was the architecture of inevitability. When a peasant looked upon those walls, they did not see God alone. They saw the unshakable will of kings, who claimed to rule by God. Have you ever stood before something so vast it made you feel both protected and imprisoned? Do you think faith can survive when it's enforced by fear? William's rule was ruthless but methodical. He counted everything: land, livestock, taxes, people. In the Doomsday Book, a ledger so absolute it was said to rival divine judgment itself. Nothing escaped its ink. It was the ultimate act of possession, not through sword, but through knowledge. The same impulse that once drove the Vikings to map coastlines now drove their heirs to map entire kingdoms. But power always breeds resistance. Whispers of rebellion stirred in the north, echoes of the old Anglo-Saxon spirit that refused to die. William crushed them with fire and famine in what history remembers as the harrying of the north. Villages burned, crops were salted, tens of thousands starved. The land that had once birthed raiders now tasted the full wrath of their descendants. If you destroy a people's memory, do you also destroy their future? Or does suffering become the seed of something stronger? Yet even amidst cruelty, there was creation. The Normans brought law, governance, trade routes, and diplomacy. They connected England to continental Europe, to art, commerce, and the Crusades. From brutality, they forged stability. From conquest, they created continuity. It was the most enduring paradox of empire. The same hands that burned could also build. By the end of William's reign, England was unrecognizable. The wild frontier of Saxon kings had become a disciplined state. Castles guarded rivers and roads. Church bells marked the rhythm of obedience. And through it all, the faint hum of the north, that restless, storm-born energy, still pulsed beneath every cathedral, every keep, every crown. What do you think lasts longer? The kingdom, or the fear that built it? If power becomes tradition, is it still tyranny? When William died, his empire was secure, but his sons would soon fight over its inheritance. The unity of the Norman vision would fracture, and the blood of brothers would stain the legacy of stone. The North had once united through conquest. Now it would divide through ambition. The story of England was no longer one of survival. It was one of succession, and the sons of the conqueror would learn that what's hardest to win is to keep. When William the Conqueror died in 1087, the empire he built trembled. He had forged a kingdom from fire and fear, but even he could not forge peace among his sons. 3 heirs stood in the shadow of the man the world called the bastard king. Each carried his blood, each carried his pride, and each believed the throne was rightfully his. If your father conquered the world, what would you inherit, his power or his enemies? And what if your greatest rival shared your face? To his eldest son, Robert Curthose, William left Normandy, the land of the ancestors, where the blood of Vikings still whispered in the stones. To his second son, William Rufus, he gave England, rich, ordered, and restless. And to his youngest, Henry, he left nothing but silver. But Henry, watching his brother's rivalry ignite, smiled. He understood what his father had not. That gold may buy time, but patience buys everything. The brothers' peace lasted days. Robert, proud and impulsive, demanded England too. William Rufus refused, and war began. A civil storm across the empire their father had built to last 1,000 years. In their struggle, the old ghosts of the North seemed to rise again. For the first time since the Viking Age, the sons of the sea were fighting one another. Can blood truly unite a family when ambition runs deeper? Or is every dynasty destined to devour itself? The year 1088 saw rebellion ignite across England. Norman lords, sworn to both dukes and kings, found themselves caught between loyalty and survival. Castles once built to guard the land now turned their walls against the crown. Smoke rose again over English hills, not from invasion this time, but from inheritance. William Rufus, fierce and cunning, crushed the revolt with brutal efficiency. He punished traitors, rewarded opportunists, and filled his treasury with confiscated wealth. The younger brother, who had inherited England, now made it his weapon. Robert, watching from Normandy, learned a harsh truth, that to rule the North, you needed more than lineage, you needed ruthlessness. Have you ever fought for something so long that you forgot why you wanted it? When victory means losing your brothers, is it still worth winning? Robert, desperate to reclaim his glory, looked elsewhere, to the Crusades. When Pope Urban II called for Christian knights to liberate Jerusalem, Robert saw his chance for redemption. He pawned his duchy of Normandy to William Rufus in exchange for the gold to go east. The land of the Vikings was sold for a pilgrimage, and as Robert rode toward the Holy Land, his homeland began to slip away forever. But fate was not finished with the sons of William. In 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, King William Rufus was struck by an arrow. A hunting accident, the chronicles said. The shaft pierced his lung. He fell without a prayer. No one carried his body to church. They left him where he lay. And before the sun set, his youngest brother Henry rode hard to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and crowned himself King Henry I. If your brother dies by an arrow, and you claim his throne by nightfall, is that fate or ambition? How thin is the line between inheritance and theft? Henry ruled with the cold intelligence that had once made him an observer in others' wars. He restored order, silenced rivals, and married an Anglo-Saxon princess, binding Old England and New Normandy under one crown. But blood never forgets. When Robert returned from the Crusades, he found his duchy taken, his name diminished, and his brother enthroned. He gathered what forces he could and crossed the channel. The last echo of Viking invasion reborn, not from foreign shores, but from within. The brothers met in 1106 at Tinchebray. The battle was swift and merciless. Henry's army shattered Robert's. The elder brother, once heir to a conqueror, was captured and imprisoned, and would remain locked away for 28 years, until the day he died. Would you rather die a free man, or live a lifetime in your brother's shadow? Is blood still sacred once it's spilled for a crown? With Robert's defeat, Henry reunited England and Normandy, a single empire stretching across the Channel, forged not by conquest this time, but by betrayal. The age of the Northmen had ended in family quarrel, their legacy consumed by the very hunger that once drove them to conquer the world. And yet, something in their blood still burned, the will to rule, to survive, to remake history in their own image. Henry, the last son of William, died in 1135. No son survived him, and once again, England would be torn apart by succession, as cousins and nobles clawed for the throne. The echo of the brothers' war would ripple for generations. Why does history repeat itself? Because we forget, or because we refuse to change? And what happens when every kingdom becomes a family argument, with no one left to forgive? The conqueror's dream, unity, power, legacy, had survived his enemies, but not his children. The castles still stood, the churches still glittered, but the blood beneath them had curdled into silence. The Vikings had once burned the world for glory. Now their heirs burned it for inheritance. Every empire dies twice, first in blood, then in memory. By the mid-12th century, the sons of the North still ruled from thrones, but their crowns grew heavy, their faith uncertain, their unity fractured. The line of William the Conqueror, born from the chaos of Vikings, tempered by the fire of Normandy, had become something colder, quieter, and haunted. Do you think power fades with a scream, or with a sigh, when the fire that built an empire turns to ash? Can anyone tell the moment it goes out? After Henry I's death in 1135, England was once again thrown into chaos. No heir stood ready. His only legitimate child, Matilda, was a woman in a world of men, and though Henry had sworn his nobles to her cause, their loyalty melted like snow under the heat of ambition. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the crown. He was charming, brave, and faithless, the kind of man history remembers for his smile before the knife. Matilda refused to yield. Brothers' blood had once divided the realm, now cousin fought cousin, and the land descended into a storm of greed and vengeance the chronicles called the Anarchy. What happens when a nation forgets who it belongs to? When every oath becomes a weapon, and loyalty is just a word for survival? Castles burned again. The same fortresses the Normans had built to rule now turned against them. Every baron became a warlord, every town a battlefield. In Winchester, monks fled their cloisters with relics hidden beneath their robes. In London, merchants prayed not for profit, but for quiet. The dream of a unified realm, the conqueror's dream, was crumbling beneath the weight of its own creation. For nearly 2 decades, the land bled. Villages were emptied, churches looted, fields left to rot. It was said that Christ and his saints slept. A chilling phrase written by chroniclers who could find no other explanation for the world's unraveling. The once mighty Norman Empire had become a ghost of order, a kingdom of ruins, ruled by fear, memory, and rumor. Have you ever lived through a silence so deep it felt like even God had left? If faith can't protect a nation, what can? Matilda fought not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. She gathered allies, crossed the Channel in storm winds, and marched through a land her father had once owned like a map of obedience. She was captured, escaped disguised in white under a blizzard's cover, and continued to fight even when victory seemed impossible. But in the end, exhaustion conquered where swords could not. Both sides agreed to peace, fragile, temporary, conditional. Her son, Henry of Anjou, would inherit when Stephen died. It was compromise disguised as destiny. When Stephen's heart failed in 1154, Henry ascended the throne as Henry II. Young, brilliant, relentless, he married Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most powerful woman in Europe, and together they built an empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. It was larger than William's dream, stronger than any before it, but beneath its crown, the same curse lingered: blood, pride, and betrayal. Can a new generation ever escape the sins of the old? Or are dynasties just mirrors, reflecting the same tragedy again and again? Henry II ruled with iron discipline, He rebuilt the legal system, restored royal power, and filled his court with poets and philosophers. He was every inch the king his ancestors dreamed of, a Viking's ambition wrapped in the robes of law and order. But like his forefathers, he made one fatal mistake. He believed his family would obey him. His sons, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, grew up in castles built on conquest and stories soaked in blood. They learned power not as a duty, but as inheritance. And soon, they would turn that inheritance against their father. But that is another storm. What would you do if the very empire you built became your cage? If the children you raised to rule began sharpening their knives in your shadow? The empire of the Normans stood at its peak, vast, glittering, invincible. Yet within it, cracks spread unseen. The same ambition that had lifted their ancestors from raiders to rulers now whispered rebellion in royal halls. The Viking fire had not gone out, it had only moved. From battlefield to family, from sword to heart, England no longer feared invaders from the sea. The danger now came from within, from sons who dreamed of thrones, from wives who plotted alliances, from kings who forgot that stone, no matter how strong, cannot outlast blood. Do you think every dynasty knows when its shadow begins to fall? Or do they all believe the sun still shines, even as night approaches? The chronicles of the age would call it the Empire of the Angevins, but history, in its colder honesty, calls it something else, the Echo of the North. Because even now, centuries after Lindisfarne burned, you could still hear it, faint but certain, the rhythm of oars against water, the heartbeat of ambition across the ages, the sound of men who could not stop reaching, even when they had already grasped the world. The empire had become shadow, but the shadow still remembered the fire. Every empire begins with a sword and ends with a sun. Henry II's empire stretched wider than any king since Charlemagne. England, Ireland, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, a kingdom of sea and stone. He ruled with brilliance and ferocity, but his sons, born to that power, learned to love it more than they loved him. If you were born into an empire, would you inherit its greatness or its greed? What happens when the sons of conquerors forget what their fathers conquered for? The eldest, Henry the Young King, was crowned during his father's lifetime, a king without a kingdom, a title without meaning. He wanted power now, not promises later. Beside him, his brothers watched. Richard, wild and radiant like the sun. Geoffrey, sharp as a blade. And John, quiet, patient, dangerous. The seeds of betrayal were planted not by enemies, but by blood. In 1173, they rebelled. The sons of the king turned on their father, allied with their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and sought the help of France, the same land their ancestors once burned and conquered. Henry II faced an unthinkable war. To defend his empire, he had to fight his own children. Could you raise your sword against the ones you raised yourself? When a family becomes a battlefield, who wins and what survives? The rebellion failed, but the scars remained. The young king died before his father, his last words whispered in guilt and fever. Geoffrey followed soon after, trampled in a tournament, his ambitions buried beneath the armor that once defined him. Only two sons remained, Richard and John. Richard, the Lionheart, embodied everything Europe adored. Chivalry, courage, the perfect image of the warrior king. But his heart belonged not to England, but to the Crusades, to the endless mirage of glory in the Holy Land. He left his kingdom behind, selling offices, taxing his people, and emptying the treasury to fund his holy war. While the world sang of his victories, England waited in silence, ruled by ghosts and greed. Do you think heroism can save a kingdom? Or does it only make legends while the people starve? If faith drives you to fight, who decides when to stop? Richard's crusade became myth, the Lionheart battling Saladin beneath the burning sun. But victory never came. He returned home not as a conqueror, but as a prisoner, captured on his way through Austria and ransomed for a king's fortune. England paid for his freedom in silver and suffering. When he finally returned, he fought again, this time in France, until an arrow struck him down in 1199, outside a petty castle. The archer was a boy. The wound turned to rot, and the Lionheart died not in battle or glory, but in decay and silence. How does a legend die? In triumph, or in an infection no one remembers? What if the greatest warriors are never buried as heroes, only as men? And then came John, the youngest, the forgotten, the one they called Lackland, because his father left him nothing. But John was patient, and patience is a weapon. When his brothers fell, he took everything. Clever, calculating, and cruel. He ruled through fear, where his ancestors ruled through fire. He lost more than any English king before him. Normandy, the heart of their legacy, slipped away to France. Revolt spread across the realm. The barons rose in defiance, forcing him to seal the Magna Carta in 1215. A charter of rights meant to chain the king himself. The conqueror's blood had come full circle, from the sword that made kings, to the ink that would begin to unmake them. Do you think freedom is born in battle, or in rebellion against your own ruler? If power corrupts, what does it take to make a king kneel? John's reign ended as it began, in betrayal. Hunted by his enemies, sick and exhausted, he fled through flooded marshlands, clutching the royal treasure. Legend says he lost it to the tides, the last wealth of the Normans, swallowed by the sea that had once carried them to glory. Days later, he died alone, his body bloated, his empire broken. The crown passed to a child. The dynasty of conquerors had become a whisper, and yet, in their fall, they left something eternal. Their castles still stand. Their language still shapes the world. Their laws still govern nations, from Viking raids to royal courts. The spirit of the North had transformed, no longer wild, but woven into civilization itself. So what do you think? Did the Vikings win in the end? Or did the world simply become theirs by forgetting where they began? Centuries later, when the English crossed the seas to build their own empires, when their ships carried flags instead of dragon heads, the same old rhythm followed them, that pulse of hunger, adventure, and mastery that had once belonged to men of the North. The tide never died. It only changed names. And somewhere, beyond the waves, you can almost still hear it. A faint, steady beat in the heart of every conqueror and dreamer since. The sound of oars in the dark. The whisper of history remembering itself. The saga that began at Lindisfarne ends here, not with fire, but with echo.